All right, we're recording, but we got a chair here. I'll slide up alongside alongside Jim here. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the next membership meeting of Ireb. Thank you for all attending. Like most of our membership meetings, we really want, when we ask folks to turn out, we like to have something important for them to show up for. So today what we've done is we put together a conversation on the immigration issues. Ireb leadership has been meeting pretty consistently for the last couple of months, trying to look for what it is that we are about next. We've done a lot of work in the community. We tried to bring whatever resources we thought were important so that people could make informed decisions. We tended to stay out of the politics of one candidate versus another. We really wanted to bring information to the community so that we would engage more people and that they would have make a better decision when they did. And so along those lines, there is a survey, as you saw coming in, and then please engage us online as well. We're looking for suggestions over where you think we would be best positioned for the next election cycle. We've already decided we're staying out of the presidential race. We don't want to pick favorites or anything. We want to facilitate people picking, what they think is the best person. And so we would like some input from the community over where you guys would like to see us go in the next couple of years. Now, having said all that, because we've been meeting about the immigration issue almost exclusively, it's something that's the leadership team on Ireb has felt very strongly about, and our membership has expressed a lot of interest in. A number of our members of our leadership team have gone out and done some of their reports. And so what I'd like to do is run around the table on some leadership reports tonight, and then we've got 3 featured speakers with us, and we'll be introducing Jana, Daniel, and Michele here in a moment, and they'll be the main event for the evening. Also, I would like to introduce our state senator, Jim Carlson, who's sitting alongside of me. He decided to show up, and I invited him to the table to participate. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
All right. So first of all, I want to maybe turn to my right, Steve Reinhardt. His report is on military families. Now, immigrants come into our country through a lot of different avenues. They're not just teaming across the border, and they come in with the best of hopes. They want to do some work and participate in our democracy. And so Steve's got a perspective on those that participate in the military. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you. So one immigrant group that the Trump administration is attacking is immigrant members of the armed services and their family members. Which is odd, because as much as Trump claims to love the military, he's, even their willingness to put themselves in harm's way for us is not enough to overcome his anti-immigrant bias. So I don't know how widely known this is, but if you join the U.S. military as a non-citizen, you get a leg up on becoming a citizen during and after that process. But it's an advantage, it's not a certainty. And about 40,000 non-citizens are currently serving in the U.S. military. So, who would have thunk it, But, and via this path, about 130,000 troops have been naturalized since 2001. So it's that's twice the population of Egan have been naturalized via this path. And the Trump administration has made that advantage smaller, with the consequence that from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 18, the number of military members who used this path to naturalization was roughly cut in half, from 7,500 to 4,100, something like that. So that's one thing they're doing. There's another program which, again, in the past, non-citizen former service members often got some leniency to stay in the country after their service ended. But that's also being scaled back, sometimes with devastating results. So Jose Segovia Benitez was brought to the U.S. from El Salvador when he was 3, joined the Marines at 18, saw combat in Iraq, and was honorably discharged after 5 years. He was a legal permanent resident when he joined the Marine Corps. He began the naturalization process while on duty, but didn't finish it. After his service, brain injury and PTSD led to severe drinking, led to felony convictions and prison time. And when he left prison in 2018, January, he was picked up by ICE and is now at the Adelanto ICE Processing Center. And the Congressional Hispanic Caucus estimates that there are about 3,000 ex-service members caught in this situation. So a third program, so-called parole in place, protects undocumented family members of active duty service members while they're deployed. And the Trump administration announced in June that program is being killed. So an example of this, PFC Barbara Vieira was killed while serving in Afghanistan in 2010. Her husband, Jose, came to the U.S. illegally in 2004, was granted a reprieve from deportation at his wife's death. And then in April of this year, he was deported to Mexico and separated from their 12-year-old daughter who stayed here in the U.S. And luckily there was an outcry, and he was allowed to come back into the U.S. to care for her. Well, the last thing in this vein is that children born overseas to non-citizen service members in the past had been automatically given U.S. citizenship. No longer true. So my opinion of our current occupant is that eventually enough people will realize what he's doing, and his support will shrink dramatically. U.S. military is one of the great homogenizing forces in U.S. society. He claims to love the military, and service members have supported him at a higher rate than the overall population. Yet many of those service members served with non-citizens in the military, and they might not take kindly to their colleagues being treated like this. So we already see signs of that, as his disapproval rate among active service members dropped from plus 9 points in 2016 to 1 point in 2018. So,
thanks, Steve. That's the military angle. I was actually going to ask our senator. You probably have some background on the programs that were actually built and put in place to build paths to citizenship that are now being torn down like this. I mean, that's what it feels like. It's structures that we spent a long time building up, giving these folks an opportunity, are just being torn apart like they don't matter.
Well, in responding to that, I don't have a lot of experience with it because we don't deal with federal issues and citizenship federal issues. But we do get a lot of people that come to us and ask us to help them get citizenship. And it got easier for a little while, and then when President Obama issued the DACA proclamation, that did help a lot of people. And in fact, there were vegan residents who were undocumented and managed to, one of them, this good friend of mine, he did get his citizenship now 2 years ago, July. And I checked with him about 2 weeks ago, and his parents have now gotten green cards. And their situation was just, as a lot of people, overstaying a visa. That's all. That's all it was.
Thanks, Jim. Ron's got another report. He's also got something along the lines with military interpreters and some of the situations that they encounter.
Yeah, I don't have much to say. I thought in our meeting we said we weren't going to do this because we didn't have enough time. So I'm just going to, I've got a few minutes here. During the Iraqi and the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, U.S. forces needed the services of various interpreters and translators and this kind of thing. There are thousands of them. And by the very act of doing that, they basically put a target on their chests. And there's a special immigrant visa, SIV, that was created under the National Defense Authorization Act in 2006, I believe it was. It was supposed to give these people a path into, residency and legal residency in the United States, and for not just for a couple of days or something, but for an extended period of time. And Trump, of course, has shredded that all to hell. I mean, these people are so desperate that many of them just they can't get in the United States. They go to Europe because their lives are in danger, and they're on waiting lists to get in here. But they're actually in places like Europe and other places in Turkey and whatever. But anyway, just an example. And this comes from you probably heard about that. This is recent news, and this is from an ABC news report. In 2016, only 325 Iraqis were allowed into the United States, Iraqi translators. In 2017, that dropped to 196. In 2018, it dropped to 2. So the Iraqis have been getting especially hammered. The Afghans somewhat less so, but it's somewhat similar figures for the Afghans. Let's see, the beginning of 2018, I think about 1,800 Afghans were brought into the United States as translators, and as of 2018, that dropped to 177. So
ones that were here were deported.
Well, no, they've never got in the United States to begin with.
Is this our number of new people?
Yes.
Okay.
These,
Wow.
So 177 people, translators, interpreters, whatever, were allowed to gain residency in the United States in 2018 compared to 1,800 the year before. So it's pretty outrageous, actually.
All right. Thanks, Ron. Lisa, now you've got another angle. You've been working with tax preparation, and there's some interesting tidbits that you brought up that happen with immigrants.
Yeah, my name is Lisa. For about 10 years, I've been volunteering doing tax preparation for lower income customers for a local nonprofit. It's through the VITA program, which is run by the IRS, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. IRS loves acronyms, so I'm going to be using a lot. And one of the clients we serve is the undocumented. And the way undocumented can file taxes is they can get what's called an ITIN, Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And this is basically for someone who needs to file taxes or needs to be on a tax return, but can't get a social security number. So besides the undocumented, it'd be like a spouse of someone who's a citizen, who's not a citizen. You can also claim relatives in Canada or Mexico as dependent on your tax returns. So functionally, it's like a social security number in terms of filing your taxes. And historically, the IRS's stance on the whole issue is, we are not immigration. It is not our job to enforce immigration policy. But if you're in the United States and working, we want you to pay your taxes. So basically, someone who's an ITIN gets a W-2 just like everyone else, and so they're paying Social Security tax. Because they don't have a Social Security number, they're not eligible to receive any of the benefits. 2010, the Social Security Administration estimated $12 billion in payroll taxes from the undocumented. That's including the employer contribution. So it'll be half from the employer, half from the employee. And that's just Social Security. So that doesn't include local, state, sales, income tax. And that is really hard to estimate. There's kind of numbers all over the map. It was like 9 billion to a couple of billion, but I mean, they're definitely paying taxes. I'm going to say that with 100% certainty. I've done their taxes. I've seen the W-2s. They are paying. But the disadvantage, though, they're paying the same amount. However, they're not eligible for certain tax credits. First off, ITIN, you're not eligible for the EIC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. If you think of it essentially as an IRS poverty program, because it's basically a tax credit for people who make very little money, that they get like additional money back. So ITIN, if the adults have ITINs, you can't get it. So they're getting less money back than a citizen who makes the same amount. And with the tax law that was changed, one of the things was affecting the ITINs. ITINs now expire after 3 years. Also, by the way, I say ITINs are easy to spot because they start with 999. And like it's basically like a letter from the IRS, tells you this is the number. And also starting in 2018, if a child has an ITIN, they are not eligible to get the child tax credit. So like I said, essentially you're getting less money back.
Paying more taxes.
Yeah, if you look at how it is. I mean, honestly, our tax system is structured like forced savings plan, you get the money taken out and you get money back. And that's just how we're been taught to think about it in the United States.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so what the reports stem from is during our leadership meeting, we were talking a lot about, the contributions that we're seeing that are coming from immigrants in our society and how they're being victimized or demonized. And people aren't seeing these types of things where they're paying taxes, but they're not getting the same credits. They're serving in our military, but we're denying them opportunity for citizenship. And so that's where we kind of wanted to set the table a little bit. Sarah, you had a report too, didn't you?
Well, I don't have a report like that. I just want to talk a little bit about the defund hate, but if you want, I can wait until.
Okay, let's say that to the end. And then, so what we'd like to do is jump right into actually what the whole reason why we're here is to hear from our three amazing guest speakers tonight. We've got Michele will be speaking first. I'm going to introduce her. Michele Garnett McKenzie is from the Advocates for Human Rights and will present on the immigration policy landscape and its impact on Minnesotans. Michele?
Well, this is an amazing group to be with. First, I did not expect we were doing a professional podcast. This is so fabulous. So thank you. And you're really digging into the nitty-gritty of the issues, which is so important to understand how many ways immigration policy impacts us, and how many ways it can fail, how many giant holes there are to fall into. And there are traps in everywhere in the system. But backing up, I should just let you know where I come from. I'm Deputy Director at the Advocates for Human Rights. We're a nonprofit organization based here in Minnesota. We work in our home community and with partners around the globe to implement international human rights standards. A lot of our local work is really focused on immigration. It's been something we've done since the early 1980s when people were first fleeing to the U.S. and able to avail themselves of an asylum system that was created in 1980. We have a huge volunteer base. We're a volunteer-driven group that really relies on working with volunteers to build the human rights movement. So volunteers work with our asylum our asylum seekers, and in all range of work that we do. And that's really what brings me into this conversation. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing at the Advocates for 20 years now. And so much of what I've been reflecting on most recently has been kind of how we've gotten to where we are. And so one thing I throw out there is that people move, right? We are a migratory species. We move around for lots of reasons. Estimates are we've moved for 200,000 years. Borders are new. Passports were not in use until really after World War I. So, that idea of a nation-state border really didn't rise up until very recently. When you weigh 200,000 years of human experience against 100 years of a rule, it's not surprising that the world community is not easily dealing with migration issues. But we also know that borders not only keep people out, they can keep people in. And, by World War II, we had genocide taking place because or facilitated by the national borders trapping people within the Nazi regime. Right? That's how our refugee system that we currently have in the United States came into being, was to provide some essential safety valve so that people aren't only able to leave their country if another country gives them a visa to enter it, but they're able to leave if they're fleeing persecution or torture and ask right at the border for asylum from persecution. That's a fundamental human right that we saw the importance of, and we know how vital that is. And in this regime, I think Jana's going to talk a lot about the litigation around the pushback on the southern border rules, but just knowing that we're turning our back on this long-held and essential right is terrifying to me, because it is really the last way that people can escape tyranny and persecution. The other piece here is context, right? Is the numbers. It seems like if we listen to the news that everybody is coming to the United States, and the only thing holding the masses of the world's poor and downtrodden is our immigration laws. There are 248 million international migrants in the world today. They're not all in the United States. We have about 1 million people immigrating to the U.S. every year, and we set that number back in 1990. We haven't updated it since then. That is not a terrifying number of people coming to the U.S. The last counts, I think, of undocumented folks in Minnesota were about fewer than 95,000 people. It's a fraction of our state's population. This is not some sort of mad rush, and I think in fact we're going to be seeing people emigrating from the U.S. as world economies shift. So the idea that more people is terrifying is befuddling, and I think it only makes sense when we put it in context of what this immigration debate is really about. It's about race. It's about creating a national identity based on being a white Christian nation. That has been the guiding principle of our immigration law since our first Immigration Act and through our most recent iteration of that.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's worse than that. The first Immigration Act in the 20s, it was actually, they wanted to keep out Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, not even white people.
No, so I agree, but that's not the first act. The first act was any alien being a free white person can apply for citizenship, 1790. That was when white people were coming from the places that the founders really were valuing. Although Benjamin Franklin would have argued that there were too many Germans coming into the United States before we were even born as a country. Too many German speakers.
One question though, at that time, then, what was the definition of white? Because at that time, I know, wasn't the Irish not considered white?
Well, and Irish weren't even really part of the mix, but that as time shifted, indeed, the laws shifted to keep out undesirable people deemed not white, people deemed not assimilable, people deemed not worthy of being a citizen.
Southern Italians were not regarded as white for a period in this country.
And so by 1790, we've got this foundational act. The 1880s, we started putting into place barriers to immigration from sort of East Coast immigration from Europe, based around poverty and location, likelihood to become a public charge, which is in play right now, found its way into our law then. And the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded people ultimately from what was known as the Asiatic Barred Zone throughout into the middle of the 20th century. Right? So both sides, by the 1920s, those quotas you talked about were in place not just to keep out people, but freeze us and return us to a generation before. The 1920s quotas really referenced the census as of 1890, and the idea that we could make America great by looking backwards was very much part of the nativism. That was part of forming the country. Those quotas, that 1924 Immigration Act, that coincides with the same year we started to recognize Native Americans as U.S. citizens. So, there's lots of intersectional oppression that needs to be dealt with in this story. But coming through the most recent Immigration Act, 1965, that is the last time we sat down as a country and decided what our immigration principles should be. That conversation was in the context of the civil rights movement. It was designed to get rid of those national origin quotas and make it not an overtly racist system, but we sidestepped that discussion. Dixiecrats were very much opposed to having a competitive merits-based system that is now the watchword for a good immigration policy. And wanted, in fact, to tie migration quotas or categories to retaining our character, our racial balance in the United States, our character as a white Christian nation, by putting into place family-based immigration categories. That's what gave us our current system, which is mainly you can immigrate if you're a family member of a U.S. citizen or someone with a green card, or if you're the best and brightest of employees, that is part of our employment-based system. Even that most recent civil rights era legislation was one that, worried about keeping America white. And we have not really resolved that. We have not sat down to have a new policy or a different policy since then. So the mess, the traps, the horrors that we see, embedded in the system that you're picking out as you go into each of these policies should not be a surprise to us. Just to kind of turn briefly, before I turn things over to asylum protections and refugee protections, the world's number of people forcibly displaced right now exceed 70 million people worldwide. That includes people internally displaced in their own countries, people who are refugees who've crossed an international border, and about 3 million asylum seekers. Last year, globally, 98,000 people were resettled to a third country. Most refugees are in refugee camps. They're not trying to get into any other country. And indeed, refugee crises really come up not when people flow out of their countries due to conflict, but when they flow out of a conflict zone into a more affluent part of the world. We saw that in Europe. We're seeing that today. The U.S. last year granted about 20,000 people asylum. I don't know how many we will get through this year in the complete chaos that's being created, but that chaos is being created with a mind to shutting down the asylum system. There's a book in my bookshelf that was dated 1994, written by John Tanton, who's sort of the architect of the current anti-immigrant movement, that lays out this entire strategy. We have to, seal off the borders, stop people from coming, make sure we don't let the third world in, and views asylum as an end run around migration. All of this is terrifying for us and our communities and our families, but it shouldn't. It's been a long time coming, and we're fighting back, I think, really effectively, despite the fact that we haven't been writing books and plotting things out for 30 years with as much determination. So I think at this point, our charge is to really get into that. What do we want the United States migration and immigration policy to be? How should we be living out concepts of give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free? How should we be making sure that people are safe from tyranny? Who are we as a nation? And we have that responsibility to put that together. So I'll leave things there and maybe turn things, I think, to Jana's next.
Yeah, Jana would be our next speaker. Thank you, Michelle. And we'll save some questions for the end. We'll more encouraging questions from the audience and any participation. I would like to also point out another one of our elected representatives has joined us, Sandy Mason. She represents Burnsville as a state representative. She's here tonight too. Thank you, Sandy, for showing up. And so our next speaker is Jana Kooren. And she's from the ACLU. And the only thing I know about her is that Bjorn got her for us. And then it's been far too long since I've made my last contribution. So take it away, Jana.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, my name is Jana Kooren. I oversee our advocacy and engagement department at the ACLU. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the ACLU and our work and kind of build a little bit on what Michelle so eloquently set up for us. So for those of all just most of you are probably at least a little familiar with the ACLU, in case you're not, right? We were founded in 1920, and we are a nationwide organization that has offices in every single state to defend people's civil liberties and constitutional rights. And we are most commonly known for our legal cases. That is kind of what we are best known for. I do not oversee that, right? I'm on our other side, which is engaging with folks like all of what you are doing. Right, showing up, talking to people, making change in the community, talking to people, doing public education, getting out there and having change happen in other ways besides just the courtroom. And aside from that, we're also at the Capitol, right? So we kind of work through solving, or we kind of work to advance people's rights by kind of addressing it in one of those three ways, or hopefully actually all together. It's the most effective, right? We can have the best way if we can file a lawsuit, but then we have people march the street, and then we have a law change by Congress, right? That's where you're going to see at least what we hope to kind of be a really effective way to defend civil liberties. I think a lot of you, or at least some of you, are probably pretty familiar with the fact that the ACLU has filed a lot of the lawsuits, or at least been a part of filing the lawsuits, or one of many organizations filing lawsuits around the crisis, or the immigration crisis. And I should say it's definitely been building, and a lot of it has been caused, like exactly what Michele said, intentionally. And I just want to build on one piece to kind of build a little bit up what Michele was saying, is that you hear routinely from this administration that they don't have the capacity or the money or the resources to do a lot. So Customs and Border Protections is one of the world's largest law enforcement organizations. And it claims, right, that it can't process more than a handful of asylum seekers at a time. But, so for context, Customs and Border Patrol processes around 100,000 travelers at the entry point, which is near Tijuana, every single day. But it only accepts 20 to 80 asylum seekers per day. So this fallacy that we don't have the capacity is just not true. We have the capacity. We are choosing not to use that capacity, right? As a result, right, we have all these people sitting on the other side of the border who are stuck in, not in a great situation because of this severe limitation that they have put on the number of people. And then you get to the other side of the border and you're stuck in detention centers where we once again have created this flow where we're not allowing people in. And instead there's a detention center waiting for a court system which is incredibly backed up. Right, and so all of this is a problem of our own making. It does not have to exist this way at all. Even if we can't win on the idea of rethinking borders, we could definitely win on the idea that we do not have to hold people in the detention center until we don't have to hold people in the detention center punitively, and we don't have to such limit the flow of asylum seekers at the border. We have the capability to process way more people than we are right now. So if you we could spend all day talking about all the different lawsuits and everything that's happening because so many pieces are going on, right? We see every single day this administration is putting forward, they're trying different tactics, different policies, trying to limit the number of refugees, trying to stymie the flow, right? We've seen multiple things happen, right? What happened day 4 of the Trump administration, right, was the Muslim ban. What the ACLU, along with many other organizations, right, showing up at the airports, filing lawsuits, putting a temporary hold, which then, as we know, was kind of somewhat limited and not completely overturned at the Supreme Court. And then we also have other lawsuits that are happening right now. And then I'm going to bring it to Minnesota in a minute. So we have... and I would say that, you oftentimes we'll get a certain far in the courts, and then now we're going up to the Supreme Court, and we don't always, unfortunately, we're not getting a lot of great results always at the Supreme Court anymore, right? So we have the ACLU alone, where we're in court working to block President Trump's abuse of emergency powers, secure funds for a border wall denied by a border wall Congress denied. Right. So in this past May, a federal judge ruled in a lawsuit, which we filed on behalf of the Sierra Club and the Southern Border Communities, that President Trump couldn't get his wall by illegally diverting taxpayer money. So we have lawsuits around that. We also have the lawsuits around the family separation. And interestingly, it took quite a while for the family separation crisis to but it took a while for the family separation crisis to really bubble up because it was happening for quite a long time. And so the lawsuit the ACLU filed happened about 6 months or 4 months before it even really started to blow up in the news. And even though, this lawsuit has been won, we know that this is still happening. And we also know that children have not been reunited and were taken away months ago. And we also know the incredibly detrimental damage we are causing to children every single day, right? That it doesn't matter, like lawsuits take forever, which is why we can't just rely on the courts and the lawsuit, which is why we need people like you who are doing what you're doing every single day, right? Because justice comes too late oftentimes if we wait for the hands of the court. And so we need to be advocating in the street for changes every single day and, at the Capitol.
So can you go into just a little bit how the family separation thing, I missed how that ended in the courts.
Well, I mean, technically it hasn't, right? Okay, so in the early 2018, we filed a lawsuit to stop the ACLU did to file a stop the separation of families at the border and to require the immediate reunion of all children. So last June, right, a federal judge issued a national injunction or lawsuit requiring the unification of thousands. Okay, so that's
June 2019.
18.
June 2018, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, and that was part of what's happening is that they keep changing the tactics to do family separation. And at that point, if mom and kiddo came to the border together, mom was being pulled out of ICE custody, put into federal criminal proceedings, and moved to a federal prison. That was the separation mechanism going on there. So.
Yeah. And so we may have gotten some good victories there, but then they change tactics and they do it in other ways, right? So we got this one positive lawsuit. So we got this one positive decision. Families are supposed to be united. It's supposed to be not happening. And now they've done things like they've limited the number of days, right? So they're saying, okay, well, you have to process people quicker, or kids can only be held for, I don't know what the current, 30, 15, 20, I think. 20. So they then change the rules and they say, okay, you can only hold children or hold families for less than 20 days. But we also know that's not actually, they're not always following this either. And so it takes so long to have everything go through courts because then you file another lawsuit, then something else changes. And then they say you have to stop doing it this way and they stop doing it that way and then they'll try another tactic. So it's kind of like whack-a-mole, right? Where it's we are getting some good victories in the court, right? But then you see something else pop up where they tweak it slightly, hoping this time it'll go through. And that's eventually what happened with the Muslim ban, right? They tweaked it, and then Supreme Court finally kind of allowed part of it to go through. And the most recent lawsuit, which had a not great Supreme Court result this week, was around who can apply for refugee status. And I feel like you probably actually are better situated than I am to talk about this being a lawyer.
Well, so the real rule is that if you are at the U.S. border or enter the U.S. by any means and are within the country, you can apply for asylum. That doesn't mean you get asylum. It means you have the right to ask. To be protected because you fear persecution on account of your race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. And claiming this false scarcity narrative that we just can't possibly, process everyone. The administration first shut down and started metering the border posts. So as Kara said, there's Kara sitting next to me. As Jana said, the border is only accepting at the port 10, 20, 30 people a day, and everybody's supposed to remain in Mexico. People are in such danger in Mexico that they're then coming through between border crossings. And once apprehended, they should have the right to seek asylum, but now there was a rule that was proposed, and now it can go forward, saying that anybody coming through that non-border post is not eligible for asylum. And there's a second one that says if you didn't apply for asylum on the way to the U.S., in another country, that you would be barred. And we have a safe third country bar. We're supposed to enter into treaties. There's a way that this is supposed to work, and it's been circumvented. And now anybody who's come into the U.S. via any other country, including Mexico, is barred from seeking asylum. And this
isn't it violent to federal law?
It does.
Statute?
It does, and that's the premise of the lawsuit. So that has not been decided yet, but there was a preliminary injunction that a lower court, the district court, had put in place. The circuit court had denied and said, no, the rule can go in place while we're fighting about whether it's legal. And the Supreme Court just said, the rule can go in place while we're fighting about whether it's illegal. So we don't know if it's illegal or not yet, but the rule's in effect as of Thursday.
Yeah. And then in that case, Ginsburg and Sotomayor were the lone dissenters in that one.
On the preliminary injunction question.
Mm-hmm. So we have this manufactured crisis at the border, right? Based on a scarcity, based on the racism our country was founded on and so deeply rooted in. And then we're also having continued problems if you look to here in Minnesota, right? So Minnesota has 5 detention centers, immigrant detention centers, and they're all civil detention centers. So keep in mind, these are all at county jails within Minnesota. They're in Sherburne, Carver, Candy, Ojai, Nobles, and Elberly.
And now Polk.
And so they're all civil detainees. So if you think of the general differences, right? So criminal people who are being held for criminal offenses are in jail, right? Are there because they've been ordered, by a judge, they've been charged with a crime, right? For civil detainees, that's not the same, right? So we have our largest facility is Sherburne. Roughly 70% of detainees in Minnesota are held in Sherburne. People detained, keeping in mind they may not be actually Minnesotans. 70% of the immigrants held in Minnesota are held in Sherburne County. So we have a problem, and additionally, for a couple of ways. First, how are our counties and different jurisdictions interacting with ICE? And then, once people are being held in civil detention facilities, we oftentimes are happening now is that people are trying to be deported to countries we never used to deport to. Or I should say, for a long time we hadn't been deporting to. Yes.
One question that I heard, if someone's in jail or if the FBI arrests someone, if you contact them, they legally have to tell you this is who we have in custody. I've heard that in ICE that they legally don't have to say who they have in custody.
Right. Yeah, ICE is an administrative agency, not a jail, right? And so this is why the distinction between criminal and civil actually has real life consequences. And so our records when dealing with administrative agencies are subject to Privacy Act restrictions. So they're not supposed to just disclose information to the public around my records or your records from an administrative agency. And it's it's private data that they're not supposed to turn over. And it's one of the reasons why detention is such an ill fit for implementing civil procedures. But there is an online detainee locator system. If you do know the person's name, spelled the way that they gave it to the Immigration Service, and their date of birth, their country, or their A number, you can usually find which detention center they're located in. But it does permit disappearance in a way that our criminal system is designed to protect against.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the population of who's being held in civil detention facilities in Minnesota, about a quarter to a third have no criminal history whatsoever. So you'll hear Trump say, we're going after, people who break the laws, criminals, right? That is what you might hear as a rhetoric of who people are going after for detention, aside from the fact that has a really flawed and fundamental understanding of what does it mean to be a criminal, right? If we can't dive into that whole conversation, that's a very different one. But if you look at even those facts, right? So in Sherburne County right now, a full, I think, third have no criminal record. So that's not even true on the supposition. If you look at the other 70-ish%, what offenses they have, we are talking about a very small percentage have anything that was even a violent offense, or I should say something that you think of when you hear language around rapists and murderers, right? There's a lot of DWI, there's a lot of other misdemeanor offenses, and some of them are from years and years and years ago. And that's one of the critical things. So we'll have clients of ours, people who 10 years ago they made a mistake, right? 2001, one of our clients, 2001, he did some damage to a property. It was criminal damage to a property. He was a lawful permanent resident prior to that, or still is technically, and he continued to show up for his regular check-ins or meetings around immigration until one time he went into the meeting and was put into detention. Right? No warning, no notice, immediately put in detention, where they tried to deport him back to Cambodia, a country that he hadn't lived in since he was a very, very young child. We have, because civil detention doesn't have the same rules that criminal detention does, such as you actually have a sentence, we see people who are held there for a very long time. We've had clients who've spent 486 days in civil detention, and most civil detention, such as Sherburne County, you don't go outside. They actually don't have a yard. They've barred person-to-person contact, so that is over a year that you can have no one come and visit you in person. You do not get the same access to medical or mental health care at the same level that you are if you're a criminal detainee under the authority of our state Department of Corrections. And the list goes on about what it is to be in civil detention. So you have people trying to increase, and the reason why people are being held so long is because they're trying to deport them to countries oftentimes that they're debating about whether or not it's still safe to send someone to, such as Somalia, right? You may have heard about that plane that famously was trying to, being sent to places that we know are still dangerous for people to go. We have clients who, because of their sexual orientation or their mental health status, would be dangerous for them to be deported back to that country. And so we have to fight individually for every single person, but there are hundreds of them.
We've already had people that have been sent back
Yes.
and died.
Exactly.
Have been killed.
Yes, exactly.
Are we keeping track of that? How many people are being murdered under these new policies that we're
Right. Yeah, and no, I mean, there's not there's no way to keep track of that, but people are trying to get some handle on that when family members go missing. It's just,
So,
yeah. And detention creates this perverse, you'll talk about the economy of it, but the longer you fight, the harder you fight your deportation case, the longer you're in jail. So it coerces the detained person into giving up without a fight. How can you sit for 400 odd days not knowing a sentence when every week ICE is coming to say, just sign and we'll get you out of here? So the harder you fight, the longer you're in jail.
And ICE keeps looking for new beds because they can't keep up with the fact that they are detaining people at a much higher rate. And I know it's true. You look at the Obama administration, and rightfully so, it was often called, Obama had been the nickname of deporter-in-chief, right? We saw deportation. This is not something new that Trump started. Many of our clients and our people were in there under Obama's era, right? We know
Family
this.
Separation.
Yes, all of this. That is not new. It has definitely increased, and it's definitely been done much more often. And I maybe, Michelle, you know these numbers even better than I do. We had been, so the average number of people on any given day, I think the lowest numbers that have been under Obama was maybe 40-ish thousand.
It started out in the high 20s.
Yeah.
And just to put it in like a little context, in 1980, there were 54 people in INS custody on an average day.
In the whole country.
The ADP for the United States was 54, and we passed 54,000 this summer as an average daily population. This is all about the money. This is where the Defund Hate campaign is really important, because this is just a cash cow. It's a cash cow to our counties. We don't have private prisons operating here, and if we do have lawmakers in the room, please, please, please do everything you can to stop that, those going online. But right now, our counties proudly advertise on their websites how much money they have saved their county taxpayers by boarding ICE detainees. Sherburne County, Candy-Ojai County, they keep a nice tally of the millions of dollars they're making to subsidize their county budgets. Sherburne County is building another, this is their 4th expansion in 30 years, all with this money.
Sherburne got $64 million. That's the cost. I mean, you ask what it's worth, what someone's life worth, and in Sherburne it's $64 million to hopefully indefinitely in their minds and expand, right? I think 300 is the number of ICE detainees they have most days.
Yeah, it's gone up a little bit.
It's gone up. So I can go up more. I think their total facility can hold 700. So depending on how many federal detainees versus state.
So the 64 million was that in a year?
No, that was what they got to start their contract. And so they've used it. So with the money, they built a beautiful new courthouse with a whole courtroom they want dedicated just to wholesale deport immigrants quicker, right? They built their county buildings. They've used it for parks.
Notably, they did not build a rec space so people could have outside access. They built this facility with no compliance with federal detention standards.
Correct. And they say that they can't, there's no way they can actually have families access people anymore. They used to. Up until 2017, they thought it was safe enough. And now in 2017, they just ended that policy and you can no longer have family visits. And instead, they're actually making more money on top of the $64 million by instituting that you can only talk to your families through a computer screen, which charges exorbitant amounts and almost never works.
Yeah, the entire system is monetized from soup to nuts.
You're getting into the prison system.
Right.
Questions.
Well,
and
the prison system
detention system.
The prison system is actually better than the ICE detention system. The prison system has made a very clear thing we will never get rid of in-person visits. The prison system doesn't have if you were going to ask me, Jana, where would you rather be held, a jail or a prison? I'll pick a prison every single day.
Absolutely.
And they have a lot of systems in place. They have programming, they have yards, they have rules and regulations they have to follow. That is not happening. That does not happen in jails and especially in the civil side of jails.
Do you have an idea of who's responsible for the difference between the counties that are holding people and the counties that are not holding?
It's the sheriffs.
Yeah.
And yeah,
the sheriff Broad is Sherburne County, and he loves it. But the sheriffs, with some input from the county board would have to approve the budget. So if we're talking about expanding, if we're talking about building, for the county board can have some oversight. But the sheriff has a lot of power to do all of this. So
and they set the conditions within their buildings with very little oversight under state law.
I mean, technically, DOC does have some oversight control. They have to license a facility to show it meets up to certain health and safety standards.
And they do.
But it's pretty minimal, and they definitely don't go beyond what they could. There's also federal standards. Interestingly, under the Trump administration itself, this past January, a report was issued by the Department of Homeland Security saying that they are failing in their fundamental duty to have safe facilities for immigrants. And they're saying we have the authority to do it and we are not doing it. Right. So even under the Trump administration, you have federal officials who are saying we are not doing what we're supposed to make sure these facilities are complying with.
Right. We've let the budget. There's no legal limit on who can be held in ICE custody. Is if the government suspects that you are here in violation of your status, you can be held. Yeah. So there's no parameters on that. It's very broad, and the only check on that has been the budget. And right after we closed Ellis Island, that was down to detention was not a priority. We had a very small budget. Today, it's infinite and getting bigger.
So when you say that they're not holding them lawfully, is that federal law or state law?
They're not holding them under the standards that the federal government has put out, but it negotiates with each jail a contract, and that's what they fall back on. They waive any of the violations under the contracts, and then you see some of these horrific shows.
Who is waiving the violations in that case?
the federal government when it signs the contract with the local
So
jail.
that's ICE or CBP that's overseeing that?
Right.
Okay.
And they're both housed under DHS. So
One thing I do want to comment here is I personally am of the opinion taxes doesn't get the attention it needs as a social justice issue. So to point out, the county is saying this is a cash cow, but then you got a question is, why don't they have adequate funding through other sources? I mean, taxes is supposed to be how counties get the money. I mean, I think that's the reality. If you want to live in a first world country where you actually expect the government to do its job, I'm sorry, that requires money.
It's their choices.
So I have a question about, it came up when you were talking, so this is, I think of this about the asylum stuff, because my understanding is that is a part of international treaties,
Right.
which have been approved by the U.S. Senate, which
Right.
means that they are part of U.S. law,
That's
and in some ways they're even like more than a law. They're almost part of the Constitution. And so I'm just curious, how can any administration say, oh, well, we don't really want to do that?
Right.
Are they also part of international law?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So there is a sort of recognized right to seek asylum. There is a treaty, the Refugee Convention, that we're party to. It establishes that basic right of non-return. If you show up at a border, you cannot be deported if you are in fear of if your life or freedom would be threatened on account of one of those protected grounds. And so the way that some of this is happening is that people will still potentially not be deported. They just won't be granted asylum. They'll be given a less permanent, less stable status called withholding of removal, and they won't be able to reunify with family or travel outside the U.S. or become citizens. It'll be, technically complying with that protection against refoulement, but it won't be going beyond that to give full asylum. So that's one way. The global community as a whole has struggled with the right to asylum. We have the Refugee Convention was negotiated, but not the Asylum Convention. And so there are some distinctions that give some wiggle room, and are implementing legislation for the International Refugee Framework, the 1980 Refugee Act, can be amended as well. So and
it has been amended to weaken it?
The regulations that are being adjusted and things, that's where that's all happening.
I see.
So it's a tougher.
Yeah, it's not as black and white.
Tougher sell in the details of that. So
I have a question. We hear a lot of the news, second-hand accounts of what's happened in these facilities, but we've heard very few first-hand accounts from families who actually have been separated and people who actually have been held in these facilities. And in fact, we generally don't even hear from lawyers representing these people. I mean, it's lawyers looking at it in a broader context we hear from quite often, but very few that represent individual clients. And why is that? I mean, is there any effort to get these stories of these people out? Or?
Well, we did have, over the summer, one of our kiddos who we represent went on tape and talked about her experience being detained under family separation 3.0 or whatever. Her mom's here in the U.S. and is our client seeking asylum and has been here for a while. The child, who was 12, was traveling with her 6-year-old sister and her aunt, who'd been in care of her for several years while mom was in the U.S. trying to get status to get them here. They crossed the border, and the children were separated from the aunt, who's a family member but not mom. And the children were in custody and became so ill they were hospitalized, and finally, in this case, the Border Patrol actually contacted mom and released the children directly to mom. So they were reunified. The aunt is still in ICE custody. And, it was odd that we had a chance to have a kid talk mom was fully supportive of her, and the little girl was able to, to speak to that. But not every 12-year-old, is equipped to do that. Not every person who's in trauma can step forward and be the person who's the spokesperson for this issue. And then our legal cases get threatened. Like her asylum case is underway, the little girl's. Anything she says on tape can be used against her. So there's all sorts of reasons why individual lawyers keep our clients really protected through these protracted situations. This is a great segue to you, I think, on the trauma effects.
Yeah, I think talking about immigration takes the wind out of me. I think I was making eye contact with Lisa. That's her name?
Lisa, yes.
Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think she saw me tearing up because I think everything that's talked about, from taxes to legality to deportations to the horrific acts of incarceration or just imprisonment, it touches me personally. And I don't mean to be tearful and, but that's the reality of things. I personally had a brother who was deported in 2015, and he was in Sherbrooke County. And so I think it's really hard to talk about, even though it didn't happen personally to me, it impacted me. And I think just listening to an hour worth of the history and the racism and the discrimination and the atrocities that are happening every day, it just takes a toll on me. And I have to go back home to my 2 kiddos and my wife, and I'm emotionally spent, and I've been sitting here just listening to the atrocities that are happening under our watch and in this country that's supposed to be the greatest country in the world, and it isn't.
I would like to jump in real quick and take this opportunity to introduce Daniel Perez, our speaker here. Daniel is a social worker who became naturalized himself, and we'll talk about the impact of policy on students. Sorry, Daniel, I just wanted to introduce you.
That's okay. So I hope to be eloquent and clear. I think if you see me struggle, I'm a little bit sick, but it's also very personal. And so the good news, I guess I should start with that, is I recently became a U.S. citizen as of September 4th of this year, actually.
Congratulations.
Very,
Really?
very, very. And I think that's both happy and also it evokes a lot of grief, because now I've also taken on the crimes of this nation, past, present, and future, and that's a lot to weigh. But I do call this country home. This is where my family lives. Although talking about immigration, me and my family are thinking about moving back in 3 years to Mexico, and not permanently. But we are a mixed status family. I have some family members who are undocumented and who won't be able to be adjusted legally. So I'm caring for them, and I know that this is public, so I'm not going to say who. I'm going to protect those people I love. But I want to mention that because I'm a U.S. citizen, my wife, my children are U.S. citizens, and we still have family members who are impacted. I work in public schools in Minneapolis, and so those are the clients and families that I serve. And so just a little bit about me. I've been here since 2002, and for the first 11 years, until 2013, I was undocumented. No papers. I had an ITIN. I started working since 2007. I pay taxes. I will never see that money, because if I were to claim that I worked and paid money to government, that will jeopardize my legality in this country. It's tricky.
You also can only get a refund 3 years.
Right, right. That's true. And most importantly, I've been working for over 10 years. But in order to have Social Security benefits, you have to work at least 40 credits, which is 10 years. I'm on my 9th year, so 36 credits. If I were to die today, my wife and my kiddos will not receive Social Security benefits because I haven't met those 40 credits, even though I've been working since 2007. So that would be 12 years, right? So for me, that's always in the background. And so those are millions of people who won't get the benefits that we actually fund into Social Security and many other programs. And so I also want to put in the record that immigrants do not just take, we give significantly more, right? And you cannot count on it. There's no data for it. But I'm so glad that you put some of the data out there in numbers. And so I want to both make it personally personal and professional, and also talk about our communities here, because I think when we talk about immigration, and I asked both Michele and Jana to talk about immigration and policy on a broad spectrum, but I want to bring it back home, right? Because as Michele said, we have 95,000 undocumented immigrants. That's a quarter of our entire immigrant population in Minnesota, right? So if we have 400,000 immigrants in the state, that's 25%. Those are neighbors. Those are families that go to school with our kids, right? Those are families who live next to you. You meet at the park, at the library. That was me 7 years ago, right? And so we are not hidden. We own businesses. We actually produce a lot of things for this state. The food we eat, right? We build your houses and buildings and many more things. And so, yeah, indeed. And so I think one of the things that I'm seeing as a school social worker, there's constant fear. There's constant struggles. Mental health crisis and issues are on the rise. And it's hard to know, right? Because we're so interconnected. It's not just that maybe it's poverty and it's housing, but then you're worried about your neighbor's situation. You might know that they're undocumented, and you know there's a nice rate coming, right? That's something that I'm seeing in the schools. There's lots of talk about immigration rates by educators, by families, by kiddos. I have had families over the last few years come and talk to me about like, hey, I'm undocumented. Can you help me in my case? Can you write an immigration letter? Or can you excuse my kiddos because they're going to be missing school because I need to keep them home because I'm going to a court hearing for immigration, right? And so kiddos are being absent. When they're in school, they're not emotionally present. They're physically present, but they're clearly not learning. And that impacts so many of our peers and family members, right? That chronic stress carries on and it's present, and kiddos are able to read it. And so I want to say that the effect is a domino effect. It compounds. And so I'm also seeing that whenever there's large conversations about race, businesses, right, lose a lot of revenue. People are not shopping. People are staying home. People are not even going to church because church might not be safe. And so the impact is so huge. And so I think for me personally, as a person who does have family members who are undocumented, I try not to pay too much attention to the news because it's a constant trigger for me, right? I get hot. For those of you watching, like my ears might be super red. If you were able to take my blood pressure, I'm pretty sure it's high. You know, that's part of living in a traumatizing world. And it's robbing so many of us years of life and peace and tranquility. And so that's the price to pay to just live in this country on top of the, I'm not going to swear, promise, on top of the crap that we get to hear about who we are as people of color immigrants, right? We're rapists and we're whatever we are, you know, the scum of the earth. And so it takes a toll. No matter how big, no matter how strong you are. And so I am seeing families shatter, kiddos, you know, whose spirits are downtrodden and just not being able to be fully who they're meant to be, right? And so I think in our schools, there's a lot of teaming of educators who are trying to educate our kiddos, but at the same time, play counselor and then a chef and an advocate and lawyer and, you know, broker and mental health case manager because the needs are so huge. And we're creating crisis in our schools, particularly, that shouldn't be there, right? Now, I can't say where I work. And I will say that, you know, there's messages from schools being sent out to parents like, we are not disclosing immigration to federal authorities. And with the public charge thing that's currently changing and shifting, and you can never keep up, families are not scared to like even get lunch or breakfast for their kiddos because at my school, for the first time ever at an elementary, kiddos are required to punch like a PIN number. I don't even know what it is because it's fairly new or very new, but like people don't know where that came from. And we're like, is it because of the public charge thing that's happening? Is federal government going to intervene here? Are they keeping track? Are they tracking the data? Are people not going to be able to get food? Or if they get food, are they putting their cases in jeopardy? Like, it's insane, right? And the mental gymnastics that people have to deal with, And of course, we do have mental health therapists in our schools who have full caseloads and cannot keep up. Just the needs keep rising and rising and rising. And so I want to talk about that because I think you made a very good question about like, why are we not hearing about it? Why are we not hearing about it? And I think I explained a little bit about why, but also I want to push back not on you, but sometimes it's like, it is very taxing. And you know what? When I am a child of God and I see my humanity in you, I don't need to know that you're struggling in order to advocate for you, right? And so I think I want to invite us to like continue advocating, even sometimes when we don't have those stories and the actual data, because we know that human beings are actually not rational. You can provide all the stats, right? And people will not be convinced. But I know that it's about human stories, right? When we can talk about our immigration stories, our struggles, whether you've experienced poverty or isolation or segregation, whatever that is, right? We can actually find common ground and really see us reflected in each other and really think about borders. As a person who holds dual citizenship, I did renounce my Mexican citizenship, and I was born in Mexico. So Mexico has another term for nationality. So I can keep my Mexican passport and my US passport, and my wife is a dual citizen, Canadian and Mexican, and our children are triple citizens, right? From birth. So I will say, for me, the concept of borders is so abstract. Like my worthiness just came into being when my Social Security was given to me in 2013. And now I'm fully worthy, I'm fully free because I'm about to receive a US passport. In what world? I've been paying taxes. I've been going to school. I've been doing decently. I've been not committing crimes. I have been a good neighbor, right? Like, and now the system says that I am worthy? Like, that is so absurd. And so I want to also call out the absurdity of our immigration system because our human experience says we have been migrants for millions of years, right? Or however long we've been on Earth. But I want to go back to the basics of what makes us who we are as humans, right? And it's the ability to live free and move and be in community with one another and not necessarily create borders, but actually bigger tables.
I'd like to talk to Bjorn about what we know. And what really bothered me was when that raid happened in, I think it was Mississippi, and they caught all the undocumented people at the chicken plants. What really made me irate was The Hill, which is a news source. The news source had lies in it. And it enraged me because it said, first of all, it called it ICE. It said, we are a police force. They called themselves police. They called themselves a law enforcement agency. So they want it both ways. They want to not be a law enforcement agency, and they also want to be a law enforcement agency when it's in the news. They want us to believe that they're a law enforcement agency, but they want it technically not to be one. And then they say, there was something else that they said in there, they didn't have to take care of the kids. Yes, they do. If they're going to be in a law enforcement agency, you are not allowed to leave those kids unattended. You cannot have a highway patrol officer pull over a car on the side of the road and arrest the driver and leave children in the car on the side of the road. That would be illegal for the policeman to do. That would be illegal. It would be illegal for a cop to go to a home, arrest the parents, and leave the children unattended in the home. They did that at those places. That's illegal. And the Hill of all places, did not do anything in their article to negate what was said. They just put it out there as if it's true.
What I thought was interesting about that particular news item too was that nothing happened to the owner of the plant. And if you dig into those more often than not, what happens is that somebody in the group starts causing trouble, like they want something.
They want their rights.
They want some sort of right. They just get rid of the whole batch of them and go hire a bunch more. Nothing happens to the owner.
And the thing is, to be there illegally is a misdemeanor at best. It's a misdemeanor. It's a felony for the owner to hire them knowing that they're not legal. So who's the one that should have been
Oh, we know who.
arrested is the owner.
And one of the things that I think has been a good move forward, and we're seeing so much, this is a cycle, right, where the federal government's really not protecting people's rights, and the states are having to step forward. And one of the things we did this past year was the wage theft legislation that was really designed to put teeth into some of our labor trafficking and exploitation enforcement mechanisms. And we have a criminal case moving forward, multiple victims who were in exactly that situation here in the Twin Cities. They were working when they wanted their payment. The labor broker called ICE and had them arrested to get new workers in, and some were deported very quickly, but others are still here. They are moving through not just their own legal status cases, but also holding that business model accountable. So this is something that states and even local governments are participating more in and have to be. And we're, so that's like an area that's been really important for us to try to get more resources into, more knowledge about, and more enforcement of, because we can't keep letting people off the hook that way. And it's happened repeatedly in Minnesota. It happens, all the time, that same sort of scenario.
Well, this leads me to I'm still trying to fathom this Supreme Court decision last week. It seems to me that the government is clearly violating black letter federal law. The Supreme Court says we're going to allow the government to break federal law, while ACLU, the relief is given to the government, which should not be given the benefit of the doubt because they're clearly breaking the law. I just can't fathom this.
We're still trotting out the national security arguments and the border, the scarcity, the border's overwhelmed argument that there's just not capacity, and so the burden on injunctions is fairly low. You have to prove that there'd be harm. So I can see how they're losing it, but it is so frustrating.
Another big question, and none of you may or may not know the answer to this. Are we detaining any number of the children particularly here? And if we are, where, if at all, they're getting hearings, are they having those hearings? I know they did at one point have that building by the airport, the federal building, but I gather they're not doing it there because the judge who was in charge of that retired. I'm a little unclear on this whole conversation, but if you have information on that, I'd be really sure.
So we don't have either a family or a children's detention center in Minnesota. Okay. So if a child is actually in ICE custody, they're not physically in Minnesota. There's a number of centers around, but we have hundreds of unaccompanied, they call them UACs, unaccompanied alien children, who are going through deportation proceedings on their own. They're the primary respondent. They're not part of mom and dad and their kids within the family, but they're themselves the person being deported. And those hearings continue on. There was a dedicated full-time docket, but that had to start under the Obama administration because we had so many unaccompanied kids that were being put into deportation proceedings by the previous administration. Right now, the docket she doesn't just have that calendar, but those hearings are still going on all the time. They're just not on a separate children's calendar.
Are they?
But they're not detained.
In Minnesota?
Yeah.
And where are those hearings mostly being held? At one place or another?
There's only one immigration court for the upper Midwest, so Minnesota, North, South Dakota, and Western Wisconsin all have hearings at that federal building.
That's what I thought.
The Whipple building. So they're all there. It's just they're not on their own calendar at the moment.
So those children that were UACs that were deported under the previous administration, were those even young children?
Sure. I mean, when I started at the immigration court, I was a clerk in '96, and we had detention center there. At that time, it was run by INS, and part of the Southwest Key company for unaccompanied kids who had been apprehended coming in at the border or found, without parents in the U.S. And we had a 3, 4, and 7-year-old set of siblings appear in court on their own. Then this is, kids get moved around, they get separated, they get sold, they get, children are moved around in the world. And so that's been a feature. At that point, INS was the custodian and the caregiver and the jailer and the deporter. So a system was set in place after a lawsuit called Flores that required that those kids be not held in INS, now ICE custody, that they were in Health and Human Services custody. And that is one of the pieces that's in play right now that the administration's trying to undermine. That Flores settlement that's still in place, that's a court order on how unaccompanied children should be treated. And so that's another complexity. But, there've been unaccompanied kiddos in our country for, when you think of the orphan trains going out across the prairies. So, our question is really, how do we care for children and what do we expect?
How are they being deported? Who do they go to?
They get on a plane and are sent to the capital city.
3-year-old?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my
and
God.
So, so it's.
Another question building on that, and I have, it's one of those things stick in your mind. You're not sure you've got them right. Am I correct that during the Obama administration, when they realized that they couldn't separate, and when they started letting people go out of there, but with the requirement they return for a court date or whatever, it was 99% returns. I am correct in that?
There's really high appearance rates for asylum seekers at their court hearings. There are a variety of community-based programs that have shown very high effectiveness. But you do see people not showing up to court because the whole system is designed for them to not know when and where to go. Mm-hmm. So during the family docket, we were out monitoring hearings. There was one kid, he was in junior high, I think, accompanied by his older sister, who had driven all the way from Missouri to his hearing in Minnesota. They had tried to change venue with the court. They'd called the court to say, we live in Missouri, not Minnesota. Can we change this? You have to file a change of venue motion. Okay. So you all know what to do if you're told that, right? So they did that. They filed a letter with the court, but they didn't serve chief counsel's office, ICE's office. So their hearing was still scheduled in Minnesota. So they drove up. The little boy sat at the council table by himself. The judge said, thank you so much for coming. I understand you live in Missouri. You want your hearing scheduled in Missouri. Yes. Okay, done. Change venue. And they had to drive home. How many of us would have done that? And luckily that kiddo had an older sister who would do that. So that's the kind of case that could fall through the cracks. ICE has been releasing people with hearing notices to appear in court with no court date on it, to be determined. And so you get a notice to appear, but it doesn't tell you when. And that is another way. The people who are being forced to remain in Mexico under the migrant persecution protocols are showing up, getting their court dates, or going to court with sometimes 24 hours notice. I mean, I think Kara has cases that they're trying to make sure the people who are scheduled to court get back to the U.S. They get no notice of their hearings. That kind of thing, it's a system that's been under-resourced chronically and is being choked into starvation, along with the care systems and the adjudication of asylum and all of that, at the expense of these massive budgets that go into the paramilitary forces that are border.
And with our, I mean, they're not UAC, but with the family separation case that we successfully won, then I don't know how close she falls with them. They said the government said you actually have to reunify them, and they weren't doing it. And then they're like, no, we want the ACLU to.
Yeah, I mean, that was if you were so concerned about these families, then why doesn't the ACLU find those families?
That's what they argued in court. And so even, I mean, our lawyers were having to, you know, and despite the fact that eventually the judge said no, but even in the meantime, our lawyers were. So our lawyers were that it was tasked, you know, with us. If you look at the size of us compared to the size of Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, our lawyers were flying down to Nicaragua, Guatemala with like children, like looking for parents. You know, they're having to make connections with local nonprofits, with local places, showing up. You know, we weren't even given the records. They said, do this, and they wouldn't even they gave us incomplete records. We didn't even have these children's, you know, parenting. How do you make sure you're matching them with the right parent? I mean, it's
so appalling. You go to Chuck E. Cheese and you get a hand stamp to get your kid out. We could have done this. There was no intention to take care of these kids.
Well, so the question though, like if your wallet gets confiscated when you're arrested, doesn't it? They have to fill out paperwork. There has to be an evidence change, blah, blah. So why isn't there a way of just recording when you take someone in custody? This is the name of the parents, the name of the child.
Right. And I think the short answer is that they just didn't care and they didn't have protocols built in. And this Customs and Border Protection, even compared to ICE, lacks so much accountability. It operates as a paramilitary organization. It doesn't issue, if they discharge a weapon, they don't have to write a use of force report. They don't, you know, they have a whole different set of operating principles. They've always set themselves up since its creation in 2003 as a Teflon organization with very little public engagement, making ICE look fabulous, you know, with liaisons and ombudsman and, you know, all these things you couldn't, in locators. CBP has custody of people for an increasing number of days after they get here. Their facilities are licensed for 72 hours. They hold people in ice boxes for weeks and weeks and weeks because ICE doesn't have the capacity. There's a solution. They could parole them. They don't need to take those people into custody. This is to end catch and release. You know, so all of these things build up, and there's no protocols in place. They don't have proper food. They don't have medication. They don't have hygienic supplies. They don't have soap. Apparently that's unnecessary. They don't have all of this, and let alone making sure that kids and parents are held together, because we don't run a penal system in the United States where children go into jail with their parents. We don't do that.
Well, thank you all. We're running up to the end of the session here, and I just wanted to make a comment on Daniel's story. We lived through the collective anxiety of this current administration. You know, I mean, as normal, you know, just as a normal course of events, and it dawned on me in a way that I never really thought about before. Just what the stress must be for people. You know, you might be snatched off the street at any moment. You won't see anyone that you would love for a year or more.
I just kind of want to say about my family history, how this kind of affects my family. My grandfather actually had dual Mexican and American citizenship because he was born in New York. When World War II started, he became an American citizen and became a medic in the Army. My grandmother was Russian. She was in Minsk when it was taken over. She was studying chemistry and spoke German. At the end of the war, she was in Germany. So that's how my grandfather and grandmother met. And so she married my grandmother to the United States. And if she had not done that, she would have been sent back to Russia and she would have been killed. And my personal opinion is that if she had to go through the system today, she would not have made the cut.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so as we're wrapping up, one note that we mentioned earlier on about making contributions. We've got some buckets over there, and part of the reason for this was to raise awareness, and we're going to be asking for contributions for these organizations that are being represented. And so I would like to turn it over to Sarah, our co-chair, talk a little bit about our call to action.
Yes, the call of action for today is has been put out in a campaign style by the National Invisible, and they're calling it Defund Hate. And I was in Sherburne County along with a couple of other people from here last night for a little rally and picketing type of event. And they're taking place this past week all over the country. And basically what it is contacting your Congress people and encouraging them not to fund any more money or give any more money to ICE or the Border Patrol. The budget is that the Congress is putting together by September 30th. We'll have to address what money we're going to put towards these organizations. And you would think that, gee, the conditions are so terrible at the border, if we give more money, maybe they'll improve those conditions. That's not been the case.
No, it won't.
They're just trying to expand so they can do the same thing to more people.
Jana, I am a member of the ACLU. Yeah. I'm a card-carrying member. No. And I know that you all have a breakfast coming up. Unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town. Can you say something about it? Because I mean, this is I know. And when Molly Ivins was here a million years ago doing a fundraiser, she hooked me in. So I know that these things, that they're well done, and there's a moment when you go, okay, I should have been doing this X number of years ago. So
I'll say the breakfast, and I also want to build on the Sherburne County action you all participated in this week too. So first of all, the breakfast is September 24th, Tuesday morning. It is at 8 a.m. The whole point of us doing it is from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. in downtown Minneapolis. You can find the address on our website, and it's free to attend, and you will be asked to give, but it's just free, so you can give at whatever level you want. It's not a ticketed gala where it's whatever what is. And we keep it an hour because the whole idea is it's supposed to build into your day where you can then go to the other things you need to do. And we keep it under an hour every single time. It's true. And we have stories, we have videos. It's not going to be a long talk like Michele and I gave, and we're going to be more like Daniel's beautiful shorter story. It's not going to be a policy thing. It's going to be talking to you, sharing it in short stories about the work we're doing with an ask to give. And building on the other things, so you had mentioned, which is wonderful, all the protests happening at Sherburne County. Like I also said, Sherburne County has some of the most appalling conditions of any of the detention facilities in our state. And that is entirely within our control. Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that ICE can have oversight, they're not exercising it. The sheriff and the county board can make decisions tomorrow that don't cost any money, or that can use the $64 million they already got without any new money that can improve the conditions for people there tomorrow. And a bunch of groups got together to submit a resolution with a lot of asks of what the jail can do to improve it. The next county board meeting is this coming Tuesday, September 17th at 9 a.m. at the Sherburne County Jail Detention Center. County board is all in one place in Sherburne County. The detention center is attached to the courthouse, that's attached to the county board meeting, that's all there. And where they're going to respond to say if they're even going to do simple things like allow people to see their family, give them better access to mental and medical health care treatment, all of that. And then from there, there's a coalition that's forming about, okay, what do we do next? We're not expecting them to actually say yes immediately. Right? And it includes the bigger asks such as don't expand your contract and eventually shut down detention, right? But in the interim, we're also looking for what can we do to make an immediate difference for the 400 people who are in there and held in terrible conditions. We've had multiple clients lose fingers indoors.
Yeah, the finger and the bad hernia operations.
Their medications are changed without adequate oversight, so they're not given, access to even like the basic standard of care, despite the fact that Sheriff Broad there will tell you it's beautiful and everything's wonderful. It is not for the hundreds of people held there every day.
Well, thank you, Jana. Thank you, Michele, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all of our guests and our leadership. That's all we have for today. All right.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. I'm in the spot. I just got a letter.
So if anyone wants one of these.